On the morning of September 23, 1857, the supply clerk at Fort Harrison stumbled upon something that would forever change how we understand the darkest chapters of American military history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When Private Daniel Cooper entered the medical storage facility to inventory supplies, he discovered rows of glass vials containing what appeared to be human tissue, detailed medical logs documenting horrific experiments, and a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous notes about the systematic torture of 145 soldiers under the guise of medical treatment. The journal belonged to Dr. Samuel Hayes, the fort's chief medical officer, who had vanished 3 days earlier along with all official records of his experimental program. What Cooper found in that storage room would expose a conspiracy so monstrous that the War Department would spend the next 40 years attempting to erase every trace of Dr. Hayes and his victims from military records. The experiments had been conducted on soldiers who trusted their doctor to heal them, men who had no idea they were being used as human test subjects for chemicals and procedures that would make modern medical ethics boards recoil in horror. Dr. Samuel Hayes arrived at Fort Harrison in the spring of 1856 with credentials that impressed even the most skeptical military officers. Born in Philadelphia in 1820, Hayes had graduated from Jefferson Medical College with highest honors and had spent 5 years working in European hospitals where he claimed to have studied under some of the continent's most innovative surgeons. His letters of recommendation praised his dedication to advancing medical science and his particular interest in treating battlefield injuries, skills that seemed perfectly suited for a frontier military post where violence with hostile Native American tribes was an ever-present reality. Fort Harrison itself stood as a testament to America's westward expansion, positioned strategically in what would later become central Oklahoma. The fort housed nearly 800 soldiers and served as a critical supply point for military operations throughout the territory. The harsh conditions and frequent skirmishes with local tribes meant that the fort's medical facilities were constantly treating wounded men, making it an ideal location for a doctor interested in trauma medicine. Hayes quickly established himself as a dedicated physician who worked tirelessly to improve the fort's medical capabilities. He requisitioned advanced surgical equipment from back east, established proper sanitation protocols that dramatically reduced infection rates, and created detailed medical records that documented every aspect of patient care. His fellow officers praised his innovations, particularly his development of new techniques for treating gunshot wounds and his experiments with pain management during surgery. The soldiers under Hayes's care initially viewed him as a godsend. Unlike the previous fort doctor, who had been notorious for his drinking and incompetence, Hayes appeared genuinely concerned with their welfare. He spent hours with wounded men, carefully documenting their symptoms and recovery progress. He established a program for treating chronic ailments that had previously been ignored, and he even provided medical care to soldiers' families when civilian doctors were unavailable. Hayes's reputation grew throughout the territory as word spread of his innovative treatments and impressive success rates. Other military posts began requesting his consultation on difficult cases, and the War Department started considering him for promotion to a position that would allow him to establish medical protocols for frontier posts throughout the West. His research papers, submitted to medical journals back east, described groundbreaking approaches to treating injuries that had previously been considered hopeless. But beneath Hayes's facade of dedicated medical service, a darker agenda was already taking shape. His true interest lay not in healing soldiers, but in using them as subjects for experiments that would advance his understanding of human physiology and pain tolerance. The isolated location of Fort Harrison, combined with the military's rigid hierarchy and the soldiers' conditioning to follow orders without question, created the perfect environment for conducting research that would have been impossible in civilian hospitals. Hayes began his experimental program gradually, starting with soldiers who were already seriously injured and unlikely to survive their wounds. He told their commanding officers that he was trying experimental treatments that might save lives that would otherwise be lost, and his early successes with legitimately innovative procedures provided cover for more questionable activities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Private James Patterson died during what Hayes described as an experimental surgery to remove shrapnel near his heart, the death was recorded as a battlefield casualty rather than a medical failure. The progression from treating dying soldiers to deliberately harming healthy ones occurred slowly enough that no single incident raised immediate suspicion. Hayes began volunteering to treat minor injuries and common illnesses, always with explanations about testing new medications or techniques that could benefit all soldiers. He established a separate treatment area in the fort's basement, claiming that the controlled environment would allow for better observation of patient responses to new treatments. The basement medical facility became Hayes's private laboratory, where he could conduct experiments without observation from other medical staff or commanding officers. He convinced Colonel James Miller, the fort's commanding officer, that his research required strict confidentiality to protect potential military advantages that might result from his discoveries. The colonel, impressed by Hayes's credentials and initial successes, granted him virtually unlimited authority over medical decisions and patient care. Hayes's experimental subjects were chosen carefully from soldiers who had few friends at the fort, men who were considered disciplinary problems, or those who came from families unlikely to investigate if something happened to them. He developed a system for gradually escalating his experiments, starting with relatively minor procedures before moving to increasingly invasive and dangerous tests. His detailed journals documented every aspect of these experiments, including the subjects' responses to various chemicals, their tolerance for pain, and the progression of symptoms as he deliberately induced diseases and injuries. The chemical experiments began in earnest during the winter of 1856. Hayes had acquired various substances through his medical supply connections, claiming they were for legitimate research into new medications. He tested these chemicals on soldiers by adding them to their food, mixing them into medicines for treating minor ailments, or applying them directly to wounds during treatment. His journal entries described the effects with clinical detachment, noting symptoms, duration of reactions, and eventual outcomes with the same precision he had once applied to legitimate medical research. Sergeant Michael Brown became one of Hayes's first systematic experimental subjects when he reported to the medical facility complaining of persistent headaches. Hayes prescribed a series of medications that were actually experimental chemicals, designed to test their effects on the nervous system. Brown's condition deteriorated over several weeks as Hayes carefully documented the progression of symptoms, including severe confusion, loss of motor control, and eventually complete paralysis. When Brown died, Hayes recorded the death as resulting from a previously undiagnosed brain tumor. The success of his chemical experiments encouraged Hayes to expand into more invasive procedures. He began performing unnecessary surgeries on soldiers, telling them that he had discovered conditions that required immediate treatment to prevent serious complications. These operations allowed him to study human anatomy in ways that would have been impossible through normal medical practice, and his detailed notes documented every aspect of human response to surgical trauma. Private Thomas Anderson was scheduled for what Hayes described as a minor procedure to remove an infected tooth, but instead underwent experimental surgery in which Hayes deliberately damaged nerves in his face to study pain responses. Anderson spent weeks in agony before developing a massive infection that killed him. The official medical record listed his death as resulting from complications following routine dental surgery. By the spring of 1857, Hayes had established a systematic program of human experimentation that involved dozens of soldiers. He had developed techniques for concealing the true nature of his activities through careful manipulation of medical records and by selecting subjects whose deaths or disabilities could be attributed to other causes. His growing confidence led him to attempt increasingly dangerous experiments, including deliberate infections with diseases and surgical procedures, designed purely to satisfy his scientific curiosity rather than provide any medical benefit. The scale of Hayes's program required assistance, and he gradually recruited other medical staff members by convincing them that they were participating in legitimate research that would advance military medicine. Nurse Mary Wilson initially assisted with what she believed were innovative treatments for wounded soldiers, but she gradually became aware that many of Hayes's procedures had no therapeutic purpose. Her attempts to raise concerns were dismissed by Hayes, who convinced her that her lack of medical training prevented her from understanding the scientific value of his work. Orderly John Smith played a crucial role in Hayes's experiments by helping to identify potential subjects and assisting with procedures. Smith's position gave him access to soldiers throughout the fort, and he developed techniques for persuading men to report to the medical facility for treatments they did not actually need. His later testimony would reveal that Hayes had promised him a percentage of the profits from any medical discoveries that resulted from their research, leading Smith to actively participate in recruiting experimental subjects. The experimental program expanded beyond individual medical procedures to include systematic studies of human endurance and psychological responses to extreme stress. Hayes created scenarios designed to test soldiers' physical and mental limits, often under the guise of training exercises or medical evaluations. These tests included exposing men to extreme temperatures, depriving them of food and water for extended periods, and subjecting them to psychological torture designed to study the breakdown of human resistance. The documentation of these experiments filled multiple journals that Hayes kept locked in his private quarters. His notes revealed a methodical approach to human experimentation that demonstrated complete disregard for his subjects' welfare. He recorded their responses to various tortures with scientific precision, noting which techniques produced the most dramatic results and documenting the progression of physical and psychological deterioration in his victims. As Hayes's confidence grew, so did his ambition to conduct experiments that would establish his reputation in the medical community. He began planning a comprehensive study that would involve deliberately infecting soldiers with various diseases to study the progression of illness in healthy young men. This research would require a larger number of subjects and more sophisticated equipment, leading Hayes to request additional resources from the War Department under the pretense of improving the fort's medical capabilities. The War Department's approval of Hayes's requests for additional funding and equipment reflected the military's genuine interest in improving medical care for frontier soldiers. Officials in Washington had no reason to suspect that their investment in Fort Harrison's medical facilities was actually funding systematic human experimentation. Hayes's reports consistently emphasized his success in treating wounded soldiers and his innovative approaches to frontier medicine, providing cover for activities that would have horrified his superiors if they had understood their true nature. By the summer of 1857, Hayes had subjected 145 soldiers to various forms of experimental treatment, ranging from relatively minor chemical tests to major surgical procedures and systematic torture. His victims included men from every unit stationed at Fort Harrison, though he was careful to spread his activities across different groups to avoid creating obvious patterns that might attract attention. The cumulative effect of his program was a gradual increase in unexplained deaths and disabilities among the fort soldiers, trends that were attributed to the harsh frontier conditions rather than deliberate medical misconduct. The isolation of Fort Harrison worked to Hayes's advantage by limiting outside oversight of his activities. Medical inspectors from the War Department visited frontier posts infrequently, and their brief inspections focused on supplies and general health conditions rather than detailed examination of treatment methods. Hayes's reputation for innovation and his impressive documentation of medical procedures convinced inspectors that Fort Harrison maintained exemplary medical standards, providing him with official validation that further protected his experimental program from scrutiny. The first signs of trouble emerged in July 1857, when Captain Robert Johnson began noticing disturbing patterns in the medical reports crossing his desk. As the fort's administrative officer responsible for maintaining personnel records, Johnson had observed an unusual spike in medical discharges and deaths among soldiers who had previously been in excellent health. What troubled him most was the inconsistency between the reported causes of death and the symptoms that other soldiers described witnessing in their dying comrades. Private William Clark had been found dead in his bunk on July 15th, officially listed as succumbing to heart failure, yet his bunkmates reported that Clark had spent his final days writhing in agony, his skin covered in strange lesions that appeared to move beneath the surface. The medical report made no mention of these symptoms, instead describing a sudden cardiac episode that had claimed an otherwise healthy 22-year-old man. When Johnson questioned Dr. Hayes about the discrepancy, he was told that soldiers often imagined symptoms that were not medically significant, and that their untrained observations should not be considered reliable medical evidence. Corporal David Thompson's death, 3 days later, followed a similar pattern of official documentation that failed to match witness accounts. The medical records indicated that Thompson had died from complications following surgery to repair a minor leg injury sustained during routine training exercises. However, soldiers who had visited Thompson during his recovery described a man who appeared to be suffering from some form of systematic poisoning, with symptoms including severe tremors, loss of vision, and periods of delirium during which he claimed that Dr. Hayes was deliberately harming patients in the medical facility. Johnson's attempts to investigate these inconsistencies were frustrated by the medical staff's insistence that patient confidentiality prevented them from discussing specific cases with non-medical personnel. Dr. Hayes explained that the complex nature of frontier medicine often resulted in unexpected complications that laypeople could not understand, and he suggested that Johnson's concerns reflected a lack of appreciation for the challenges involved in treating seriously ill patients with limited resources. This explanation satisfied Colonel Miller, who instructed Johnson to focus on administrative matters rather than questioning medical decisions. The situation escalated when Sergeant Peter Davis approached Johnson privately with information that contradicted everything the medical staff had been reporting. Davis had been assigned to help transport patients within the medical facility, giving him access to areas that most soldiers never saw. He described a basement treatment room where he had witnessed Dr. Hayes performing procedures on conscious patients who were clearly suffering extreme pain, despite Hayes's claims that his new anesthetic techniques eliminated surgical discomfort. Davis reported seeing soldiers strapped to examination tables while Hayes applied various chemicals to their skin, carefully documenting their reactions as they screamed and struggled against their restraints. He described shelves lined with glass containers holding what appeared to be human organs and tissue samples, along with detailed charts tracking the progression of various experimental procedures. Most disturbing was his account of Hayes discussing his work with Nurse Wilson and Orderly Smith, describing the soldiers as test subjects rather than patients requiring medical care. The revelation that Hayes might be conducting unauthorized experiments on soldiers presented Johnson with a dilemma that reflected the rigid hierarchy of military command. Direct accusations against a respected medical officer required substantial evidence and could result in serious consequences for Johnson if his suspicions proved unfounded. However, his responsibility to protect the soldiers under his command demanded that he investigate further, despite the risks to his own career. Johnson began conducting his own careful investigation. By speaking privately with soldiers who had received treatment from Dr. Hayes, what he discovered was a pattern of medical encounters that seemed designed more to satisfy scientific curiosity than to provide therapeutic benefit. Soldiers reported being given medications that made them violently ill, undergoing surgical procedures that seemed unnecessary, and being subjected to examinations that involved painful testing with no apparent medical purpose. Private Samuel Mitchell provided the most detailed account of Hayes's experimental methods. Mitchell had reported to the medical facility with a minor cut on his hand that required cleaning and bandaging, a routine procedure that should have taken minutes to complete. Instead, Hayes had insisted that the wound showed signs of infection. That required intensive treatment involving the application of various chemical solutions. Mitchell described hours of agony as Hayes methodically tested different substances on his wound, carefully noting the results while ignoring Mitchell's pleas for the treatment to stop. The treatment had continued for several days, with Hayes requiring Mitchell to report back for additional applications of increasingly painful chemicals. Mitchell's hand had eventually healed, but not before Hayes had deliberately infected the wound with different substances to study their effects on human tissue. The entire ordeal had been documented in Hayes's medical notes as an innovative treatment for preventing infection and battlefield injuries, with no mention of the experimental nature of the procedures or Mitchell's suffering during the process. Similar accounts emerged from other soldiers who had undergone what they initially believed were routine medical treatments. Hayes had developed sophisticated techniques for concealing the experimental nature of his procedures by framing them as necessary medical interventions or innovative treatments that would benefit other soldiers. His authority as a medical officer and his reputation for advancing frontier medicine provided cover for activities that would have been recognized as torture if conducted by anyone without medical credentials. The psychological manipulation employed by Hayes proved as effective as his medical authority in preventing soldiers from reporting their experiences. He convinced many of his victims that their suffering was necessary for advancing medical knowledge that would save lives in future battles. Soldiers who questioned his methods were told that their lack of medical training prevented them from understanding the scientific value of procedures that seemed painful or unnecessary to untrained observers. Johnson's investigation revealed that Hayes had been systematically targeting soldiers who were unlikely to be missed or whose complaints would be dismissed by military authorities. Men with disciplinary problems, those from poor families with limited education, and soldiers who had few friends at the fort were disproportionately represented among Hayes's experimental subjects. This selection process demonstrated a calculated approach to human experimentation that prioritized Hayes's research goals over any consideration for his victims' welfare. The scope of Hayes's experimental program extended beyond individual medical procedures to include systematic studies of human endurance and psychological responses to stress. Johnson discovered that Hayes had been using his authority to assign soldiers to duties that were actually experimental scenarios designed to test their physical and mental limits. These assignments included extended periods of isolation, exposure to extreme weather conditions, and tasks that involved deliberate sleep deprivation and nutritional restriction. Soldiers assigned to these experimental duties were told they were participating in training exercises designed to prepare them for challenging frontier conditions. Hayes documented their responses with the same scientific precision he applied to his medical experiments, recording detailed observations about the breakdown of human resistance under various forms of stress. The data collected from these experiments was intended to support Hayes's research into human physiology and psychology, research that he planned to publish in medical journals as groundbreaking advances in understanding human limitations. The discovery that Hayes was conducting psychological experiments in addition to medical procedures revealed the full scope of his systematic abuse of military authority. Johnson realized that virtually every aspect of medical care at Fort Harrison had been corrupted by Hayes's research agenda, turning the facility designed to heal soldiers into a laboratory for human experimentation. The trusted doctor responsible for maintaining the health and welfare of the fort's personnel had instead been systematically harming them while documenting their suffering for his own scientific advancement. Johnson's attempts to gather evidence against Hayes were complicated by the doctor's careful destruction of records that might incriminate him, and his manipulation of remaining documentation to support his claims of legitimate medical research. Hayes had anticipated the possibility that his activities might be discovered and had developed contingency plans for concealing evidence and discrediting potential accusers. His position as the fort's senior medical officer provided him with authority over medical records and the ability to control access to information about his experimental program. The challenge of exposing Hayes's crimes was further complicated by the involvement of other medical staff members who had been complicit in his experimental program. Nurse Wilson and Orderly Smith had participated in procedures that they knew were causing unnecessary suffering, making them potential accomplices who might face serious consequences if Hayes's activities were revealed. Their fear of punishment created additional obstacles to Johnson's investigation, as they had strong incentives to support Hayes's version of events rather than admit their own involvement in harming soldiers. The systematic nature of Hayes's experimental program and his careful documentation of procedures created a situation where exposing his crimes would require access to evidence that he controlled completely. Johnson realized that successfully challenging Hayes would require support from higher military authorities, but requesting such support would mean making accusations that could destroy his own career if they could not be substantiated. The rigid hierarchy of military command that normally provided structure and order had become a barrier to protecting soldiers from systematic abuse by a trusted medical officer. The breakthrough in Captain Johnson's investigation came from an unexpected source when Private Daniel Cooper approached him with information that would expose the full extent of Dr. Hayes's experimental program. Cooper had been assigned to inventory medical supplies in preparation for the fort's quarterly report to the War Department, a routine task that provided him with access to areas of the medical facility that were normally restricted to authorized personnel. What he discovered during his inventory would provide the evidence that Johnson needed to challenge Hayes's activities. Cooper's initial discovery occurred when he noticed discrepancies between the medical supplies listed in official records and the actual contents of the storage areas. Large quantities of chemicals and surgical instruments had been requisitioned from the War Department under the justification of treating battlefield injuries and conducting research into frontier medicine. However, many of these supplies appeared to have been used for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate medical care, and Cooper found evidence that Hayes had been acquiring additional materials through unofficial channels. The most damning evidence emerged when Cooper discovered Hayes's private laboratory hidden behind a false wall in the medical facility's basement. The laboratory contained equipment and materials that clearly had no legitimate medical purpose, including devices designed to restrain conscious patients and instruments that appeared to be intended for causing rather than treating injuries. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass containers holding human tissue samples and organs that had been preserved for study, along with detailed charts documenting the effects of various experimental procedures on living subjects. Cooper's exploration of the laboratory revealed the systematic nature of Hayes's experimental program through detailed records that documented every aspect of his research. Multiple leather-bound journals contained meticulous notes describing experimental procedures, subject responses, and the progression of artificially induced diseases and injuries. The clinical precision of these records, combined with their complete disregard for the welfare of experimental subjects, painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as medical research. The journals revealed that Hayes had been conducting experiments that went far beyond anything that could be justified as medical treatment or legitimate research. He had deliberately infected healthy soldiers with various diseases to study their progression in young, physically fit subjects. Surgical procedures had been performed purely to satisfy scientific curiosity, with no intention of providing any benefit to the patients. Chemical compounds had been tested on human subjects to determine their effects on different organ systems, with careful documentation of the suffering these tests produced. Cooper discovered that Hayes had been categorizing his experimental subjects according to various physical and psychological characteristics, treating them as laboratory animals rather than human beings deserving of medical care. The records showed that he had been deliberately selecting subjects based on their vulnerability and isolation within the military hierarchy, targeting men who were unlikely to be believed if they reported abuse or whose deaths would be easily explained as resulting from frontier conditions. The scope of Hayes's experimental program became clear through documentation, showing that he had subjected soldiers to procedures designed to test human tolerance for pain, exposure to extreme temperatures, and various forms of psychological torture. These experiments had been conducted under the guise of developing treatments for conditions that soldiers might encounter in frontier warfare, but the records revealed that Hayes's true interest lay in advancing his understanding of human physiology and psychology through systematic abuse of his position as a medical officer. Cooper's discovery of the laboratory coincided with Hayes's increasing desperation to conceal evidence of his activities as he became aware that his experimental program was attracting unwanted attention. The doctor had begun systematically destroying records and disposing of physical evidence that could incriminate him, while developing plans to relocate his research to a location where he could continue his work without military oversight. His preparations for departure included arrangements to transfer his most valuable research materials and to eliminate witnesses who could provide testimony about his experimental program. The revelation that Hayes was planning to disappear with evidence of his crimes prompted Cooper to immediately contact Captain Johnson with information about the hidden laboratory. Johnson realized that they had a limited window of opportunity to gather evidence before Hayes could destroy it completely, and he began planning a comprehensive search of the medical facility that would expose the full extent of the experimental program. The challenge lay in conducting such a search without alerting Hayes to their activities and giving him the opportunity to complete his destruction of evidence. Johnson's strategy involved coordinating with other officers who had become suspicious of Hayes's activities while maintaining the appearance of routine military operations. The plan required careful timing to ensure that Hayes would be away from the medical facility when the search was conducted, and Johnson used his authority over duty assignments to create opportunities for accessing restricted areas without arousing suspicion. The success of the operation would depend on their ability to document Hayes's crimes before he could complete his preparations for departure. The search of Hayes's laboratory on September 20, 1857, revealed evidence that exceeded even Johnson's worst expectations about the scope of the experimental program. In addition to the journals and tissue samples that Cooper had discovered, investigators found detailed photographs documenting experimental procedures, correspondence with contacts outside the military who were interested in Hayes's research, and financial records showing that he had been receiving payment for providing information about his experiments to private organizations. The photographic evidence proved particularly damning as it provided visual documentation of Hayes conducting procedures on conscious, restrained subjects who were clearly suffering extreme pain. The images showed soldiers in various stages of experimental treatment, with detailed annotations describing the procedures being performed and the subjects' responses. These photographs had apparently been taken for Hayes's own documentation purposes, providing irrefutable evidence of systematic torture conducted under the guise of medical research. Johnson's team discovered that Hayes had been maintaining detailed psychological profiles of his experimental subjects, documenting their responses to various forms of abuse and categorizing them according to their resistance to different types of torture. This research appeared to be intended for publication in medical journals as groundbreaking studies in human psychology, with Hayes planning to present his systematic abuse of soldiers as legitimate scientific research that would advance understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. The financial records found in Hayes's laboratory revealed that his experimental program had been partially funded by private organizations with interests in developing techniques for interrogation and control of human subjects. These arrangements had provided Hayes with resources beyond what the military had authorized, allowing him to acquire specialized equipment and materials for conducting experiments that would have been impossible with standard medical supplies. The involvement of outside organizations suggested that Hayes's activities were part of a broader network of unauthorized human experimentation. The correspondence files discovered during the search showed that Hayes had been sharing information about his experimental techniques with other researchers who were conducting similar programs at different locations. This network of communication had allowed Hayes to refine his methods based on the experiences of other individuals who were systematically abusing their positions of authority to conduct unauthorized human experimentation. The existence of this network suggested that the problems at Fort Harrison were part of a much larger pattern of abuse that extended beyond the military. Johnson's investigation revealed that Hayes had been planning to publish his research in respected medical journals by presenting his experimental data as the result of legitimate studies conducted with proper authorization and subject consent. The doctor had prepared detailed reports describing his findings while omitting any mention of the unauthorized and abusive nature of his research methods. This strategy would have allowed him to gain recognition in the medical community while concealing the criminal nature of his activities from professional colleagues who reviewed his work. The discovery of Hayes's publication plans revealed the full scope of his ambition to use his systematic abuse of soldiers as a foundation for advancing his career in the medical field. He had apparently viewed his position at Fort Harrison as an opportunity to conduct research that would be impossible in civilian medical settings, taking advantage of military hierarchy and isolation to create conditions where he could experiment on human subjects without oversight or accountability. His ultimate goal appeared to be establishing himself as a leading researcher in human physiology and psychology through work that involved systematic torture of the soldiers under his care. The evidence gathered from Hayes's laboratory provided Johnson with irrefutable proof of systematic human experimentation that had resulted in the deaths and permanent disabilities of numerous soldiers. The scope and systematic nature of the abuse made it clear that Hayes had been operating a comprehensive research program that treated soldiers as expendable test subjects rather than human beings deserving of medical care. The discovery of this evidence would force military authorities to confront the reality that one of their trusted medical officers had been conducting systematic torture while maintaining the appearance of providing exemplary medical care to frontier soldiers. The confrontation between Captain Johnson and Dr. Hayes took place on the evening of September 21, 1857, in Colonel Miller's private office at Fort Harrison. Johnson had spent the entire day organizing the evidence discovered in Hayes's secret laboratory, creating a comprehensive presentation that would leave no doubt about the systematic nature of the experimental program. The leather-bound journals, photographic documentation, preserved tissue samples, and correspondence files were arranged methodically on Miller's desk, creating a horrifying display of evidence that documented nearly 2 years of systematic torture, conducted under the guise of medical research. Colonel Miller's initial reaction to Johnson's accusations reflected the disbelief that would characterize the military's response to the scandal throughout the investigation. Miller had worked closely with Hayes for over a year and had consistently praised the doctor's dedication and innovative approaches to frontier medicine. The suggestion that this respected medical officer had been systematically torturing soldiers seemed impossible to accept, particularly given Hayes's reputation for advancing medical care at the fort and his apparent success in treating wounded soldiers. Hayes's response to the accusations demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had allowed him to conduct his experimental program without detection for such an extended period. He initially denied all allegations while expressing shock and disappointment that his innovative medical research was being mischaracterized as abuse by individuals who lacked the medical training necessary to understand advanced treatment techniques. His calm, professional demeanor and detailed explanations of his procedures created doubt about Johnson's accusations, even in the face of overwhelming physical evidence. The doctor's strategy involved reframing each piece of evidence as legitimate medical research that had been taken out of context by military personnel who did not understand the scientific methods involved in advancing frontier medicine. He explained the hidden laboratory as a necessary precaution to protect sensitive research from interference by soldiers who might panic if they misunderstood the nature of experimental treatments. The tissue samples and organs were described as specimens collected during routine autopsies to advance understanding of diseases common among frontier soldiers. Hayes's explanation of the photographic evidence proved particularly disturbing as it revealed the extent of his psychological manipulation of both his victims and military authorities. He claimed that the images documented innovative surgical techniques that required detailed visual records for future reference and potential publication in medical journals. The apparent suffering of the subjects in the photographs was dismissed as temporary discomfort necessary for procedures that would ultimately benefit other soldiers facing similar medical challenges. The journals containing detailed records of experimental procedures were presented by Hayes as evidence of his dedication to advancing medical science through careful documentation of treatment outcomes. He insisted that the clinical language used to describe subjects' responses reflected standard medical terminology rather than callous disregard for human suffering. Each entry was explained as part of a comprehensive research program designed to develop more effective treatments for conditions commonly encountered in frontier military service. Colonel Miller's struggle to reconcile Hayes's explanations with the evidence presented by Johnson reflected the broader challenge that military authorities would face in acknowledging the systematic abuse that had occurred under their oversight. The institutional pressure to maintain confidence in military medical care, combined with Hayes's reputation and professional credentials, created powerful incentives to accept explanations that minimized the severity of his actions while preserving the integrity of the military medical system. The turning point in the confrontation came when Johnson presented testimony from soldiers who had survived Hayes's experimental procedures and were willing to describe their experiences in detail. Private Samuel Mitchell's account of his treatment for a minor hand injury provided specific information about Hayes's methods that contradicted the doctor's claims of legitimate medical research. Mitchell described being subjected to painful chemical applications that continued long after his wound had healed, with Hayes explicitly stating that the treatments were designed to test the effects of various substances on human tissue. Sergeant Peter Davis's testimony of witnessing procedures in the basement laboratory provided additional evidence that contradicted Hayes's explanations of his research methods. Davis described seeing conscious soldiers restrained against their will, while Hayes performed procedures that served no apparent medical purpose. His account of Hayes's discussions with medical staff about experimental subjects rather than patients revealed the systematic dehumanization that characterized the experimental program. The most damaging testimony came from Nurse Mary Wilson, who had initially been manipulated into participating in manipulated in Hayes's experimental program before gradually realizing the true nature of his activities. Wilson described how Hayes had convinced her that they were conducting innovative research that would advance military medicine, only to discover that the procedures involved systematic torture of healthy soldiers who had been deliberately subjected to painful and dangerous treatments with no therapeutic benefit. Wilson's detailed account of Hayes's methods revealed the sophisticated techniques he had developed for conducting human experimentation while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical research. She described how Hayes had created elaborate justifications for each experimental procedure, always framing the suffering he inflicted as necessary for advancing medical knowledge that would benefit other soldiers. His ability to manipulate medical staff into participating in his program demonstrated the systematic nature of the deception that had allowed him to continue his activities for such an extended period. The revelation that Hayes had been receiving financial compensation from private organizations for sharing information about his experimental techniques exposed the broader implications of his program beyond the immediate harm to soldiers at Fort Harrison. The correspondence files discovered in his laboratory showed that he had been part of a network of researchers who were conducting similar experiments at different locations, sharing techniques and findings that advanced their collective understanding of human responses to various forms of abuse. These external connections revealed that Hayes's experimental program was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of unauthorized human experimentation that exploited military authority to conduct research that would have been impossible in civilian settings. The involvement of private organizations suggested that there were powerful interests willing to fund systematic abuse of military personnel for purposes that went beyond advancing medical knowledge to include developing techniques for interrogation and control of human subjects. Johnson's investigation into Hayes's financial arrangements revealed a complex system of payments and resource sharing that had provided the doctor with equipment and materials far beyond what the military had authorized for his medical duties. These arrangements had allowed Hayes to acquire specialized instruments for restraining conscious subjects, chemicals for conducting toxicity experiments, and photographic equipment for documenting his procedures. The sophisticated nature of his experimental setup demonstrated long-term planning and substantial external support for his activities. The discovery of Hayes's publication plans revealed his ultimate goal of using his systematic abuse of soldiers as a foundation for establishing himself as a leading researcher in human physiology and psychology. He had prepared detailed research papers describing his findings while completely omitting any mention of the unauthorized and abusive nature of his experimental methods. These papers were designed to present his work as legitimate scientific research conducted with proper authorization and subject consent, allowing him to gain recognition in the medical community while concealing the criminal nature of his activities. Hayes's strategy for concealing the true nature of his research involved sophisticated manipulation of medical terminology and research protocols to make systematic torture appear to be innovative medical treatment. His journals demonstrated how he had developed techniques for describing the infliction of pain and suffering in clinical language that obscured the deliberate and unnecessary nature of his procedures. This approach would have allowed him to publish his research in respected medical journals without alerting reviewers to the abusive methods he had used to gather his data. The scope of Hayes's experimental program became fully apparent when Johnson's team conducted a comprehensive review of medical records for all soldiers who had received treatment at Fort Harrison during Hayes's tenure. The analysis revealed that 145 soldiers had been subjected to various forms of experimental treatment, ranging from minor chemical tests to major surgical procedures and systematic psychological torture. The cumulative impact of this program represented one of the largest documented cases of systematic human experimentation in American military history. The variety of experimental procedures documented in Hayes's records demonstrated the breadth of his research interests and his willingness to subject soldiers to virtually any form of abuse that might advance his understanding of human physiology and psychology. Chemical experiments had involved testing the effects of various toxic substances on different organ systems, with careful documentation of symptoms and progression toward death or permanent disability. Surgical procedures had been performed purely to satisfy scientific curiosity, with no consideration for the subject's welfare or the potential medical benefits of the operations. Psychological experiments had involved subjecting soldiers to various forms of mental torture designed to study the breakdown of human resistance under extreme stress. These procedures had included prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and systematic humiliation designed to destroy the subject's sense of identity and self-worth. Hayes's detailed documentation of these experiments revealed his scientific interest in understanding the techniques most effective for controlling and manipulating human behavior. The revelation that Hayes had been conducting experiments specifically designed to develop interrogation and torture techniques exposed the potential national security implications of his program. His research into effective methods for breaking down human resistance and extracting information from unwilling subjects suggested applications that went far beyond advancing medical knowledge to include military and intelligence purposes. The involvement of private organizations in funding his research raised questions about who might be interested in applying his findings and for what purposes. Johnson's investigation revealed that Hayes had been systematically targeting soldiers who were most vulnerable within the military hierarchy, selecting subjects based on their isolation and the likelihood that their complaints would be dismissed or ignored by military authorities. This selection process demonstrated calculated predatory behavior that prioritized Hayes's research goals over any consideration for the welfare of the soldiers under his care. His ability to identify and exploit vulnerable individuals revealed sophisticated understanding of military social dynamics and power structures. The psychological profiles that Hayes had developed for his experimental subjects revealed the extent of his dehumanization of the soldiers under his care. These documents describe human beings in terms of their experimental value, categorizing them according to their physical characteristics, psychological vulnerabilities, and resistance to various forms of abuse. The clinical language used to describe systematic torture demonstrated Hayes's complete separation of his research interests from any recognition of his subjects' humanity or rights to medical care. The discovery of Hayes's contingency plans for concealing evidence and escaping accountability revealed his awareness that his activities constituted serious crimes that could result in severe punishment if discovered. These plans included detailed procedures for destroying documentation, disposing of physical evidence, and discrediting potential witnesses who might provide testimony about his experimental program. His preparation for departure from Fort Harrison suggested that he had anticipated the eventual discovery of his activities and had developed strategies for continuing his research at other locations. The systematic nature of Hayes's evidence destruction efforts created challenges for military investigators attempting to document the full scope of his experimental program. Many records had been destroyed or altered to conceal incriminating information, and physical evidence had been disposed of in ways that made recovery impossible. The remaining evidence provided overwhelming proof of systematic abuse, but investigators recognized that the complete extent of Hayes's crimes would never be fully documented due to his successful destruction of much of the evidence. Hayes's disappearance on September 22, 1857, occurred just hours before military authorities planned to place him under arrest pending a formal investigation into his experimental program. His escape suggested advanced knowledge of the investigation's progress and possible assistance from accomplices who had helped him evade military justice. The timing of his departure, combined with the systematic destruction of evidence that preceded it, demonstrated careful planning and preparation for avoiding accountability for his crimes against the soldiers under his care. The manhunt for Dr. Samuel Hayes began immediately after his disappearance from Fort Harrison, but the vast Oklahoma territory provided countless opportunities for a determined fugitive to evade capture. Military authorities coordinated with federal marshals and local law enforcement across multiple territories. But Hayes had apparently prepared extensively for his escape and possessed resources that allowed him to stay ahead of his pursuers. Reports of sightings came from as far away as California and Texas, but none proved credible enough to lead to his capture. The investigation into Hayes's experimental program continued despite his escape, as military authorities worked to understand the full scope of the systematic abuse that had occurred under their oversight. Captain Johnson led a comprehensive review that examined every aspect of medical care at Fort Harrison during Hayes's tenure, documenting the experiences of soldiers who had survived experimental procedures and attempting to identify all victims of the program. This investigation revealed that Hayes's crimes were even more extensive than initially suspected, with evidence suggesting that his experiments had directly caused the deaths of at least 30 soldiers and permanent disabilities. In dozens more. The military's official response to the Hayes scandal reflected the institutional pressures that favored concealing rather than exposing systematic abuse within the ranks. While authorities acknowledged that serious misconduct had occurred, they emphasized their commitment to preventing similar incidents rather than fully documenting the extent of Hayes's crimes. The final report classified many details of the experimental program as confidential, limiting public knowledge of the systematic torture that had been conducted at Fort Harrison while Hayes maintained his position as a respected medical officer. Colonel Miller faced a military tribunal that examined his oversight of the medical program and his failure to detect Hayes's experimental activities despite numerous warning signs. The proceedings revealed that military command structure had created conditions where a trusted officer could conduct systematic abuse with minimal oversight, as the combination of Hayes's medical credentials and his apparent success in treating wounded soldiers had provided cover for activities that should have attracted immediate investigation. Miller was ultimately reprimanded for inadequate supervision but retained his command, reflecting the military's reluctance to acknowledge systemic failures that had enabled Hayes's crimes. The soldiers who had survived Hayes's experimental procedures faced a complex aftermath that combined physical and psychological trauma with the challenge of seeking recognition and compensation for abuse that the military preferred to minimize. Many victims suffered permanent disabilities that affected their ability to continue military service or transition to civilian employment, yet official records often failed to acknowledge the connection between their conditions and Hayes's experimental treatments. The military's emphasis on maintaining institutional credibility created barriers to providing adequate care and compensation for soldiers who had been systematically tortured by a trusted medical officer. Nurse Mary Wilson and orderly John Smith faced disciplinary action for their roles in Hayes's experimental program, though both claimed they had been manipulated into participating without understanding the true nature of the procedures they were assisting. Wilson's testimony revealed how Hayes had gradually involved medical staff in increasingly questionable activities while convincing them that they were advancing legitimate medical research. Her account demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation that Hayes had employed to recruit accomplices while maintaining plausible explanations for procedures that involved systematic torture of patients. The broader implications of the Hayes case extended far beyond Fort Harrison as federal authorities began investigating connections between his experimental program and similar activities at other military installations. The correspondence discovered in his laboratory suggested that a network of researchers had been conducting unauthorized human experimentation at multiple locations, sharing techniques and findings that advanced their collective understanding of human responses to various Forms of abuse. These investigations revealed disturbing patterns of systematic misconduct that had exploited military authority to conduct research that would have been impossible in civilian settings. The private organizations that had provided funding and resources for Hayes's experimental program disappeared quickly after his exposure, with their representatives denying any knowledge of the true nature of his research activities. Federal investigators found evidence that these groups had been interested in developing techniques for interrogation and control of human subjects, suggesting that Hayes's systematic torture of soldiers had served purposes beyond advancing medical knowledge. The involvement of civilian organizations in funding military human experimentation raised serious questions about oversight and accountability in government-sponsored research programs. The fate of Hayes himself remained a mystery that would persist for decades after his disappearance from Fort Harrison. Occasional reports claimed sightings of a man matching his description, working as a doctor in remote locations throughout the American West, but none of these accounts could be verified by authorities. Some investigators theorized that Hayes had been eliminated by his former associates to prevent him from revealing information about the broader network of human experimentation, while others believed he had successfully established a new identity and continued his research in locations where oversight was even more limited than it had been at Fort Harrison. The long-term consequences of Hayes's experimental program became apparent as surviving victims aged and developed medical conditions that could be traced to their experiences as test subjects. Former soldiers reported developing unusual cancers, neurological disorders, and psychological conditions that medical experts eventually linked to their exposure to experimental chemicals and procedures during their service at Fort Harrison. These health problems provided ongoing evidence of the lasting harm caused by Hayes's systematic abuse, but the passage of time and limited documentation made it difficult for victims to obtain recognition and compensation for their suffering. The institutional memory of the Hayes scandal within the military gradually faded as officials who had been involved in the investigation retired or died, and new generations of officers took command without detailed knowledge of the systematic abuse that had occurred at Fort Harrison. This loss of institutional knowledge contributed to conditions that allowed similar incidents to occur at other installations, as the lessons learned from Hayes's crimes were not effectively transmitted to future military leaders responsible for overseeing medical programs. Federal legislation passed in response to the Hayes case established new oversight requirements for military medical research, but these regulations proved insufficient to prevent future incidents of unauthorized human experimentation. The complex nature of medical research and the authority granted to military physicians created ongoing opportunities for abuse, particularly in remote installations where oversight was limited and the potential for detection was minimal. The Hayes case became a cautionary example that was studied in military medical schools, but the specific techniques he had developed for concealing systematic abuse continued to pose risks that were difficult to address through regulatory approaches alone. The discovery of Hayes's personal effects in an abandoned cabin in Colorado Territory in 1863 provided the first concrete evidence of his fate. Since his disappearance from Fort Harrison, the cabin contained journals documenting continued experimental activities conducted on travelers and settlers who had sought medical treatment from a doctor calling himself Samuel Harrison. These records revealed that Hayes had continued his systematic abuse of vulnerable individuals while maintaining the facade of providing medical care to frontier communities that lacked access to qualified physicians. The 1863 discovery also included evidence that Hayes had been developing even more sophisticated techniques for human experimentation, building on the experience he had gained during his time at Fort Harrison. His later journals described experiments that involved entire families and demonstrated an escalation in both the scope and brutality of his research activities. The isolation of frontier settlements had provided Hayes with opportunities to conduct Research that exceeded even the systematic abuse he had perpetrated against soldiers at Fort Harrison. Local authorities in Colorado found evidence that Hayes had been responsible for numerous unexplained deaths and disappearances in frontier communities throughout the territory. His medical credentials had provided him with access to vulnerable individuals seeking treatment, and his systematic approach to selecting victims had allowed him to continue his experimental program while avoiding detection by territorial law enforcement. The pattern of his activities suggested that he had spent the years following his escape from Fort Harrison, developing and refining techniques for conducting human experimentation in civilian settings. The final confirmed evidence of Hayes's activities came from a journal discovered in 1867 that documented his death during an attempt to conduct experimental procedures on members of a Native American tribe who had captured him while he was traveling through their territory. The journal, written in Hayes's distinctive handwriting, described his capture and the tribe's discovery of surgical instruments and chemicals in his possession that revealed his intention to conduct unauthorized medical experiments on tribal members. His death appeared to have resulted from the same type of systematic torture that he had inflicted on countless victims throughout his career. The Hayes case ultimately became recognized as one of the most extensive documented incidents of systematic human experimentation in American history, involving the systematic torture of 145 soldiers over nearly 2 years of unauthorized research activities. The sophistication of his methods and the scope of his experimental program provided insights into the potential for abuse within institutional settings, where authority figures possessed both the means and opportunity to exploit vulnerable individuals. For research purposes, modern medical ethics standards and oversight procedures were developed partly in response to cases like Hayes's systematic abuse of military authority to conduct unauthorized human experimentation. The principles of informed consent, independent review of research protocols, and protection of vulnerable populations reflected lessons learned from historical incidents where trusted authority figures had exploited their positions to conduct systematic torture under the guise of advancing scientific knowledge. The Fort Harrison Medical Facility was eventually converted to other uses after the military determined that the association with Hayes's experimental program made it unsuitable for continued medical operations. The building that had housed his secret laboratory was sealed and eventually demolished, but local residents reported strange occurrences in the area for decades afterward. Some claimed to hear sounds of suffering emanating from the ground where the laboratory had been located, while others reported seeing apparitions of soldiers in period uniforms walking through the area at night. The legacy of Dr. Samuel Hayes serves as a permanent reminder of the potential for systematic abuse when institutional authority combines with scientific ambition and inadequate oversight. His case demonstrated how respected credentials and apparent dedication to advancing knowledge could provide cover for activities that involved systematic torture of vulnerable individuals who trusted authority figures to protect rather than harm them. The 145 soldiers who suffered under his experimental program became symbols of the price paid when institutional safeguards failed to protect those most vulnerable to abuse by trusted authority figures. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.